Hello, firearms friends. I love an origin story almost more than anything in fine arms collecting, and Colt has one of the best. So what we're going to look at today is three very early revolvers in the Colt history, but they're not just, each of which is supremely collectible in its own right, but each one with its own unique twist that just sets it above and beyond. Starting at my right, you can probably tell it from a mile away, this is the very distinct Colt Paterson. Now, of course, we call them Colt Patersons, but there was nothing about the Colt name attached to this. These are, of course, Samuel Colt's design, but they're being manufactured by the Patton Arms Company in Paterson, New Jersey, hence their nickname today. In addition to making revolving rifles and revolving shotguns, they also made three sizes of revolver, the largest of which is, of course, the number 5. They saw darn good use with the Texas Rangers by the like of Jack Coffee Hayes, which is why today the number 5s bear the nickname the Texas Paterson. These are some of the most collectible in the Colt field of collecting. Even though they didn't bear the manufacturer name, they're some of the most collectible. Number 5s especially, because they have not only the Colt history, they have the Texas history, and they are rare. You're talking 1,000 of these long barrel number 5s ever produced. So the Paterson as a collectible has a lot going for it. Now, what's the above and beyond? What's the twist on this Paterson? Well, you'll notice most Patersons do not have a loading lever. And here we have one with, frankly, a lot of similarities to a Walker loading lever. Notice the taper here, notice the single spring back here, the single retention flat spring at the back. So when you see a Paterson with a loading lever, most of those loading levers are the work of Mr. John Ehlers. Now, after the Patton Arms Company went bankrupt, Ehlers was one of the major stockholders, and so of course most of the assets come to him after the bankruptcy. And he, in an effort to recoup some of his money, made some improvements to the Patersons, one of which was a loading lever. So when you see them on there, most of them they're the Ehlers improvements. This is one of the exceptions. Now, an Ehlers improvement loading lever is a 2-piece loading lever. This loading lever is a 1-2-piece, and you notice a joint here as the third one that pushes is actually pushing rounds into the cylinder, a 3-piece loading lever. Well, why is that significant? Well, there are experts who have looked at this gun, and they surmise that while Ehlers had a 2-piece, that Samuel Colt was actually developing loading levers for the Patersons before the company went into receivership. So what we have here is one of the perhaps very few Samuel Colt designed loading levers on a Paterson. So a Paterson of any kind, supremely collectible. If you have one with a 3-piece loading lever, that's beyond a regular Paterson. That's beyond an Ehlers improved Paterson. Now you have something with a unique touch of Samuel Colt, and why this one is the next level in Colt Paterson collecting. Now, if you're familiar with the Colt story, you already know the next revolver on the table, and that is when in 1847, Samuel Colt took the friendly recommendations of one Captain Samuel Walker to improve the Paterson revolvers, and the result was what we have before us, this much larger, much more powerful, and more rugged revolver than its Paterson predecessors. It's the model 1847, forever named after its contributor and known as the Colt Walker. This is the first revolver under the Colt name. Those say that the Walker gave Samuel Colt the keys to the mint. It is the start of the Colt brand that we all know today. When it comes to Walkers, it's got the rich Colt history. It has Texas Ranger history. They're just incredibly significant. Only 1,000 made for the Marshall contract, another 100 made for civilian market and Samuel Colt presentation. So 1,100 all day, and that's it. Of course, the ravages of time and their hard use, there are far, far fewer today. These are collecting royalty. When you see a Walker in any condition, a Walker is collecting royalty. The third most expensive gun to date ever sold by Rock Island Auction Company. Is what we've called the Danish Sea Captain Walker. One of the civilian cased versions sold for $1.8 million. We've also had the privilege to offer the last Marshall Walker, E Company 120, and that sold for just over $1 million as well. So there's no disputing their significance to the fine arms field. Now what we have here is Walker B Company 175. Well, you've heard me mention E Company 120, B 175. What does all that mean? For the military contract, these were issued to various companies, A through E, and they were issued in amounts of 220 to each company, except for E Company, which got 120, and they were issued in pairs. So this is one of the 220 issued to B Company 175. Today, very few of any Walker left, but several years ago when people were inventorying these, there were, I think, 27 B Company Walkers. There may be fewer today, there may have been more discovered, but either way, less than 3 dozen B Company Walkers. So not only are they royalty, not only are there few left, B Company 175 has been under the eye of experts for decades. And they have found some fantastic things. So above and beyond Walker, here's what B Company 175 offers. First of all, fantastic condition as far as its originality, its completeness. Walkers, for those that aren't familiar, suffered a lot of replacement parts. They were mixed and matched. They were refurbished at arsenals. Of course, part of the Walker story very famously is ruptured or burst cylinders. B Company 175 is a remarkable example in terms of completeness. As far as matching numbers, they are just all over the place. It's a fantastic example of a Walker as it stands alone. But there's some unique twists to B Company 175. One you may be able to see from there, and that is this distinct dovetailed rear sight. Not a typical rear sight as we would see like notched into the hammer. This hammer does not have a notch. So we have this rear sight. Now, as these experts have looked at this, not only have they verified the completeness and originality of B Company 175, they've looked at this sight and postulated it may be one of the 17 Walkers that was sent back to Colt to have this modification done. Now, the Rangers were known to have preferred notch rear sight in both their Walkers and the later Dragoons than these typical very, very small sights, almost unusable sights that were located on the hammer. You notice that we also have the modification to the loading lever. Not, as we mentioned, this sort of tapered Walker-like loading lever here on the Patterson with the tapered front part and the single spring at the back. Here we have very much a Dragoon catch, and of course you see it on later Colts as well. So that modification may have been done at the same time as the rear sight, making the gun much more practical. Now, the third thing is a little more than just the percentage of originality or some period modifications. Those are things you will frequently encounter on Walkers, on good Walkers. There are some markings. So we have, we'll get close-ups of these so you can see them. We have a JG marked here on the frame and a G marked just forward of the barrel wedge. This is the same G, it's the same font, same stamping. And as this is passed through historians and experts who've examined this over decades, this gun has been in the eye for decades. There's a couple schools of thought on what these markings might mean. Very unique to Walkers. These are not typically marked. One is that JG would be the mark of the gunsmith who performed these period modifications on the Walkers, marking his work. It's a good theory. There's also a theory that's it's slightly more historically significant than that. And that is that in 1848, 1849, there were, of course, Native American hostilities on the frontier, and the Texas Rangers are called to deal with this. When they are called to deal with this, there is a shipment of 500 Colt Walkers sent from the Baton Rouge Arsenal. And these are D Company, E Company, and a series of B Company, serial numbers 61 through 220. Well, that includes, I just got goosebumps. That's B Company 175. So you know it was at Baton Rouge Arsenal. You know when it was there, and you know it was shipped out to the Texas Rangers to go fight in the frontier. That's an incredible history. Now, the Texas Rangers, this comprises several groups, several captains that are being tasked to go and fight Native Americans out on the frontier. one of the captains that's being sent out there with this group of serial number is James Grumble, JG. That's pretty fantastic. Now, also serving in another company, there's a private James Gardner. It could be JG James Gardner. He was a private. He also eventually would live in Massachusetts, where this revolver was found in the 1930s. But it's also a little more plausible to think that Captain Grumble would have had the authority to have this sent back to Colt for these modifications on this revolver. Regardless of what school of thought you subscribe to regarding this Walker, the fact that you know where it was, when it served, who it served with, is just a whole new level of cool applied to fine arms collecting. But as they say, but wait, there's more. This Colt is a first-hand testament to the Walker history, because as it's also been examined by experts over the years, they have found a crack that goes from one of the chambers in the cylinder to the arbor pin hole. Again, goosebumps, because part of the Walker's inseparable history is its documented instances of cylinders rupturing or exploding, oftentimes because men hadn't seen revolvers before, they didn't know how to use them, they were overfilling these cylinders with powder, and it caused obviously some catastrophic malfunctions. Here you have firsthand part of the story that you can hold, and it's a cracked part, just a crack on the cylinder on the verge of rupturing. It is not ruptured, it is still whole and complete, but the fact that that's there is, I mean, it's like holding part of a Colt history book in your hand. As if a Walker wasn't enough, there's part of the story that you can actually see firsthand. B Company 175 is a true prize for a collection. And next on our table, we have another very early, rare Colt revolver, and perhaps one of the most misunderstood. It's a Colt Dragoon, so right after 1847, Colt wasted no time in making improvements and seeing the shortcomings of the Walker. 1848, he begins making Dragoons. 49, you have baby Dragoons and pocket. It's 49 pockets. So things took off quickly for Colt. But in the very earliest Dragoons, you have one of these. And as mentioned, these may be one of the most misunderstood of the Colts. And that is because in mid-1950s, a man named John Fluck produced a paper detailing what he thought were a unique subset of Dragoons. He termed them the Walker replacement Dragoons. They're marked very, very similarly to a Walker. And based on his observations at a fairly limited sample size and a letter from Sam Colt, he came to the conclusion that these Walker replacement Dragoons were numbered in 300, because a letter from Sam Colt indicated that there were 300 with burst or ruptured cylinders or various malfunctions. And so that letter with the serial number range he was observing, he came to the conclusion that there were 300 Walker replacement Dragoons issued out to replace those malfunctioning Walkers. Now, since the 1950s, obviously you have access to a lot more information, a lot more resources, and we can draw some different conclusions. In fact, back in 2007, there was a paper written by the American Society of Arms Collectors which details exactly what I'm about to tell you now, and that is that Fluck Dragoons aren't a range of 300 serial numbers that were made to replace Walkers. Instead, it's a range of 650 to 700 and more that were actually part of the first government contract of Dragoons. So the second Colt government contract ever. So he went from the Colt Walker, which were numbered 1 through 1100, and then the 250 transitional Walkers, so there's up to serial number 1350. At that point, he breaks off and to start the next government contract, the Dragoons, on perhaps for ease of accounting, who knows, started with serial number 2000. Well, around serial number, the sources in the American Society of Arms Collectors say around 650 or 2700, the die wears out. The die simply is no good to make these small Walker-sized numbers anymore, and he switches dies. He's using larger numbers now. This is the difference that Fluck noticed, but he arrived at the incorrect conclusion. What they actually are is part of this very unique and very small range of serial numbers of some of the very earliest Dragoons that Colt ever manufactured. So out of the 19,000 Dragoons that were produced, you have first model, you have second model, you have third model, and I would argue as a subset of collecting that this first government contract of Dragoons is perhaps the newest subset, previously collected as Fluck Dragoons, but now with an increased serial number range. The American Society of Arms Collectors does cite in their paper that this goes from serial number 2000 to about 2700. And as with most things Colt collecting, there's never an exact hard number. For example, this serial number is 2768. So it even expands the bracket of known serial numbers with these smaller Walker markings. I think that's incredibly significant if you're a collector of early Colt revolvers, of Dragoons, maybe even of Walkers. This Fluck Dragoon, or first Dragoon contract Colt, is just incredibly significant. If that weren't enough to be of this rare subset, it still has a lot of the matching numbers. I mean, you can see them under here, 1, 2, 3, 4 matching numbers, and yes, they are all in that same small numbered font as our Walkers. Well, ladies and gentlemen, those are 3 significant early Colt revolvers with important history, unique details, and supreme collectability, and all 3 are part of the offerings at our May 19th through 21st Premier Firearms Auction. I encourage you to check out the website, rockislandauction.com. Not only can you learn more about these Colts, see close-ups, see beautiful photographs, but of hundreds of Colts, over 100 Class 3, hundreds of Winchesters, the Greg Lamp collection. It'll all be there as part of our May Premier Firearms Auction. Thanks for watching, everybody. Until next time, keep your powder dry.